I've heard of the N4 notice.
Yep.
Is that something that the landlord needs to fill out right away?
Yeah, that's the N4 notice is a notice that starts the whole process. And like I say, it should be filled out. Generally, you give 5-10 days after the rent is first in arrears. Another common problem that people think is that you have to, like if the tenant doesn't pay March rent and you fill out the N4 and then they don't pay April rent and then they fill out another N4. The first N4 you give them is good right up until the time that everything is paid. So if you give them an N4 in March and it runs into April and they still haven't paid the March rent, the N4 captures the rent that's due in April, and you can use that at any time. The other problem, if you wait for several months or there's a convoluted accounting or whatever, then it becomes difficult to account for the monies that are owing on the N4. Like they paid $300 in March, but it bounced, and then in April they paid $200, and you go through. I've even had some landlords come with like a year and a half worth of a complicated accounting. And one of the things about the form is it has to be absolutely precise in the sense of it's like a couple of dollars off or $1 off in terms of the rent that's owing. So the landlord, in other words, the tenant can come to the board and say, well, the landlord said I owed $8,292 in rent, and actually I owed $8,291, and that's sufficient to not just get rid of the dollar, but to have the whole thing thrown out and go back from the start again. So the simplest way to do it is when the rent first goes into arrears, give them an N4, because the accounting is very simple, right? They didn't pay the rent for March, or they paid a part of the rent for March. They were supposed to pay $1,500. They only paid me $1,200. Give them a notice for the $300.
So what happens in April if they still don't pay rent? Do you put some amounts in that form when you submit it to, I guess, the landlord and tenant board?
Yeah, well, if let's say you give them a notice in the middle of March and it tells them to pay the outstanding, like we used an example of $300 owing from $1,500, right, and the notice would be 14 days, and let's say it comes due April 10th. So April 10th comes around. If they pay the $300 during March, then you have to start all over again for April. But if they don't pay the $300 during March and it runs into April, then what happens is that you would make the application to the board, and there's another form. It's called an L1, but generally people file it online, so the form's not terribly relevant. And it'll ask you, the amount that's due for not only March, but for April. You have to include in that form any other rent that's become owing.
I see.
And then the N4 notice isn't actually voided or considered to be satisfied until the rent is entirely in good standing. Mm-hmm. So let's say you give them an N4 notice again to pay $300. It's outstanding, but they don't pay it until April 5th. Well, it still doesn't void the notice because they would have to pay the April rent in addition to that in order to invalidate the notice.
Okay. And the board will recognize that when you file the L1 application?
Yeah, it'll ask you specifically.
I see.
To claim all the rents that are due and owing up until the date of filing, and then even after filing, like when you go to the actual hearing, there'll be another form. There's no shortage of government forms being in Ontario that you have to fill out saying, okay, well, this is what's happened since we filed the application. The application says this is what's happened since we gave them the N4.
What is that form? What is the name?
That's called an L1, L9 information update as of the hearing day.
I see.
And that's exactly what it does, is update the information.
Okay.